Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The recent claim the U.S. bombed a Syrian military installation may be a telling example of how Washington and its allies intend to escalate their war on the Syrian regime and state, and not against terrorists. It would appear Assad remains target number one. To CrossTalk the Syrian Civil War, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's editor of Politics First magazine. In Washington, we have Ivan Elan. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. And in Beirut, we cross to Martin Jay. He is a journalist working for Deutsche Welle, Daily Mail, The National, and Al Jazeera. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus, there's still conflicting reports on what happened a few days ago, but there has been reported that a Syrian air base was bombed by the American Air Force, some jet planes going over. Of course, there's this denials and there's finger pointing and all that, but I find it very interesting. This could be a possibility for the escalation of the war against the Assad regime and not against terrorists, because we have the bombing campaign over the last year where the Americans have not targeted terrorists, but mostly infrastructure. Is this an escalation in your mind?
I believe it's quite telling that, and I think there is the potential for greater American military intervention in Syria. And why do I say that? Because the West, led by the United States, is still sticking to its objective of seeing the overthrow of President Assad, who's the legitimate president of Syria in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter. And the West, along with its allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are still supporting various Islamist groups in Syria. And so this conflict, it's going to go on and on and on unless the West and its allies stop all forms of support to those Islamist groups in Syria. And, you know, this might sound offensive to some people watching this programme, but I actually happen to believe there is, potentially speaking, a military solution to the conflict in Syria. Yep. If the Turkish-Syrian border can be sealed off, because that's where most of the Islamist fighters and the jihadist fighters have flowed into Syria from. If that can be sealed off, if America and its allies in the region can stop all forms of support to Islamist groups in Syria, then the Syrian army, which is the heart and soul in the fight against Islamist terrorism, full stop, in conjunction with the Russian Air Force, can slowly but surely liberate Syrian territory. So while politicians in the West are talking about a political solution, I can't see how there will be a political solution, because they are still supporting with arms, money and logistics those Islamist groups in Syria.
If I can go to Martin, I mean, when I look at Western politicians and they talk about a quote-unquote political solution in Syria, it's always the solution they want, what they push, their agenda and the people that they believe they're on their side. And you listen to someone like, you know, David Cameron, and he has these 70,000, you know, magical moderates out there. You know, I don't know where they are. He claims they're there. Again, you know, we're at cross purposes here, and this is what is very dangerous, because if now the U.S. is going to start targeting Syrian military installations, well, it's only a matter of time before it escalates. And you know where I'm going with this. Russia is supporting the government in Damascus. Go ahead, Martin, in Beirut.
Yeah, it's very worrying, isn't it?
Yes.
It seems, if you can go beyond the sensationalism from the British press, it seems as though we're heading towards, I'm almost afraid to say it, a World War III scenario.
I agree, and that's why we're doing this program. I constantly point out to our viewers, we do have that potential. The day Vladimir Putin announced Russia's greater involvement in the Syrian Civil War, I said the risks just got higher as well. This is not risk-free for Russia or anyone. Let's not kid ourselves here. Sorry for interrupting you, Martin. Continue in Beirut.
No, I think the worry is from the West is that they've never done the homework properly. London and Washington have never really understood Syria or President Assad. Syria, for a long time, if you go back in history, has been isolated by its own devices, simply to survive in the region from other countries taking it over. So being isolated was how Syria survived. The West never understood that. Americans never understood that. In 2007, I was in Syria when the West was trying to bring Assad in from the cold. So he was a good guy in those days when they wanted to use him as a proxy agent to talk to all the people that they didn't want to talk to. He had excellent relations with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with the Iranians. And that went all out of the window very, very quickly when the United Nations pointed the finger at the Assad regime for the assassination of Hariri, something like a year later. So we've got a lot to learn about the Syrian regime and Assad. What worries me more than anything is that nobody in the West seems to have a long-term plan about what to do if, in the event, I'm almost afraid to say it, that Mr. Assad is removed.
Well, you know, I'll make a prediction. Mr. Assad will be in power when Barack Obama leaves office. But we have a long way before we get there. Ivan Elan, if I can go to you in Washington here. You know, I find it just really quite remarkable when Russia was invited to intervene in this conflict in Syria to attack terrorist groups and groups that are illegally trying to overthrow the legitimate government in Damascus. All of a sudden, it's the Western mantra. We got to go and bomb Syria here. You know, you have the French talking about it. You have the British having a vote on it. And this is this escalation here without cooperation with Russia that is actually, given most accounts, making some progress with the regime in Damascus in fighting terrorists here. Why the sudden Western interest here? Why do they want to start bombing when they had that chance for quite a while? Go ahead, Ivan.
Well, I think, you know, they've been hung up on this getting rid of Assad, and I think they're kind of caught in that position now. It always seemed to me to be a bad idea if you want to battle the extremist groups, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and ISIS. And it's, of course, you know, you may not necessarily like his politics or his human rights record, but the other side is a whole lot worse. And so I think, you know, this has become sort of a, you know, geopolitical football between the great powers, and I think they really ought to get rid of that. I think they really need to. I don't think there can be a peace settlement because these extremist groups aren't going to play ball. But at least you could have a united effort in doing something about the extremist groups. If the Russia and the West were able to come together and decide that perhaps Assad could stay around for a while or maybe permanently.
You know, Marcus, I find it really just so incredible that the United States, that has no real national interest whatsoever in this conflict at all, except for it just has to put you know, it has to be a hammer that nails down everyone in its way. You know, why should they decide who rules in Damascus and who doesn't? Because, you know, it has been proposed on the Russian side. It was scoffed at in Western media and Western governments to have an election sometimes next spring or in summer. And you know why they don't want it? Because they don't want the results. They don't want the result of election in Syria because it wouldn't be the result they want, okay? And this is the problem here. And this is what I find so problematic, because everyone says, oh, look at the death toll and it's Assad's fault and all that. That's not true. It's patently untrue. It's the outside that has kept this war going on. This would have been over long ago if the Saudis weren't involved, the Turks weren't involved, the Qataris weren't involved, and I can go on and on and on. This would have been over. These are the powers that keep this conflict going. Go ahead, Marcus.
I agree with 99% of everything you've just said, Peter. There's just one thing I might slightly disagree with you about. I think for policymakers in Washington, they do have a geostrategic interest in this conflict. I don't believe, actually, that the Americans were behind the so-called Arab Spring. I think the Americans are opportunists, and I think there's been an unofficial policy in Washington for a long time that if they see an opportunity for a change of government in Syria, then they will go for that. They will pursue that unofficial objective, because I believe the West is playing a game of chess, a strategic game of chess in Syria. They know, and they're absolutely correct to believe this, that if they overthrow the Syrian government and install an Islamist pro-Western government in Damascus, Russia's influence and power in the Middle East would be gone, period. Iranian influence will be gone. Israel will lose its archenemy, and Hezbollah will eventually become a spent force. But if I can just very quickly say something, Peter, that you mentioned just now about the debate we had in the House of Commons last week. You know, the British Defence Secretary, Philip Hammond, he cited that figure of 70,000 so-called moderate rebels. Well, that conflicts with what the American officials have been testifying on Capitol Hill before committees, because in the last few months they said there's about 4 to 5, which is absolutely laughable. But the Brits are saying there's 70,000. But, you know, I mean, there is no 70,000, it's simple as that. But if, hypothetically speaking, there were 70,000 moderate rebels and these people were the salt of the earth, they were whiter than white, they still should not be supported. Why? Because that is illegal. That contravenes international law. No one has the right to support an armed group on the territory of another independent sovereign country. So, number one, there are no 70,000 moderate rebels.
Marcus,
the Americans have said that.
I agree with you 99%, okay? And if there's just 1% I wouldn't agree with you with, there are moderates on the ground, and they're fighting right now. It's called the Syrian Arab Army. They're the only moderates in Syria fighting right now, and no one gives them that credibility. No one ever talks about how those men and women and civil servants and policemen all along the from every single layer of official society, they've given their lives to fight for this regime, okay? Yeah. All it is ever demonized in the West, it's give people in the problem that in Syria is that no one that is for the regime is given any kind of agency at all. And we all know on this program here, we're going to shortly go to a break, that if that regime were to be physically overthrown illegally, there would be a sectarian bloodbath of unbelievable magnitude. And this is what keeps these people fighting here. All right, I'm going to have to interrupt myself, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Okay, Martin, I'd like to go back to you in Beirut and reflect upon something you said earlier in the program and something that we heard from Marcus in London. And it said, you know, when Washington sees its opportunity for a regime change, I mean, when you think about it in this century, the number of secular regimes that have been destroyed in the greater Middle East is really quite remarkable, and so quickly here, and what's replaced them. And it's usually just chaos, desperation, and more geopolitical instability here. And the same old bad players are involved here. I mean, so one has to ask the question, and you're in the region here. I mean, is this just chaos theory, intentional destruction of the region? Because we see one example after another: Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Syria. I mean, it's the same game plan over and over again, and the results are always the same. So why do people in Washington, or maybe Washington, expects the black flag and complete chaos because maybe they think they can control it? Can you make some sense to this for me? Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a danger of some of us being quite naive about America's interest in the region. But there's a shocking amount of hypocrisy, though, from Washington. And you're right to touch on the point that America's foreign policy in the last 30 or 40 years has been, in some cases, a calamity, a trail of havoc from Vietnam all the way to present-day Syria. I mean, the idea of Americans bombing anything in Syria, I think, is quite alarming. But the hypocrisy stands out. There is chaos in the region. That's actually escalating now. It's becoming more binary, and more Shia-Sunni divides are springing up all over the place. And the great worry here in Lebanon, for example, is that Lebanon becomes a sort of Iraqification as well. Into the mix. But I think Marcus is quite wrong to say that the Americans don't have any interests in the region. They have many interests in the region. And if you look beyond some of the watered-down editorials and some of the poor journalism that we have to put up with because of the situation of the war, there are journalists not being able to get in, and also Western media more or less taking the line of Washington anyway. There are vested interests. Energy is a huge interest of the Americans in the region. Just before the Syrian war kicked off in 2011, there was a huge deal on the table from the Qataris to build a huge gas pipeline right across the Arab Peninsula. And that was countered by the Russians and the Iranians, who said, no, well, actually, we'd like to put our gas pipeline from Iran across Syria. And that was also, importantly, part of the Iran deal. Let's not forget that as well. So there are interests. There's also interest from America to keep their Arab Gulf partners on board. I mean, the relationship between Saudi Arabia at the moment and America has never been so tenuous and so delicate. So there are interests in the region, and I think it's very naive for us to say that America is
I think
banding about in the region.
One of the interesting things is when you look at what's going on here and all of the conflicts that I mentioned, and even going back to the end of the Cold War, is that, there's this law of unintended consequences. If I go to Ivan Elan in Washington, D.C. about this, I mean, there's this expectation that no one wants to eat crow because Assad still has to go. I find it even remarkable that some Western politicians even go to the extent of saying, well, the Syrian army can continue to fight ISIS, but Assad can't. I mean, what kind of, are we in the 6th grade here? I mean, who's coming up with these ideas right here? This is truly remarkable. And then you have a president in the White House that is actually quite gleeful to see a setback for Russia in one form or another. You can like Vladimir Putin, you can hate Russia, whatever. That's all nice and fine, but it has nothing to do with the situation on the ground. They are actually physically fighting terrorists. I mean, when they start blowing up tankers on the ground, and then everybody else wants to imitate them. That must be something good here. I mean, so how do you explain that mindset, Ivan Elan, in Washington?
Well, I just think that, we have these ideas of dictators, and we tend to demonize them here, as we did with Saddam Hussein, Milosevic in the Balkans, et cetera. And we've demonized the Assad family, including the latest Assad. And, of course, we did that with Gaddafi. And we took out Gaddafi even after he started playing ball with the West. He compensated the people for terrorism, got rid of his nuclear program. And, of course, that's a bad symbol for everybody else to cooperate with the U.S. because if they get on the bad list initially, they're always on the bad list no matter what happens. So I think that's a problem here. And I think you're absolutely right. This Assad thing is just, if you keep the entire structure of the Assad regime, but get rid of Assad, I'm not sure that really solves anything from even the U.S. perspective. So I think it's just this idea that they want to get rid of Assad because they said they did. So it makes no sense. And I think there are conspiracies in foreign relations, but when dealing with the U.S. government and choosing between conspiracy and incompetence, I usually pick incompetence. And I think that's the policy is just completely muddled in Syria.
Yeah. Now, Marcus, I think it was over the last 10 days or so, and looking at the reaction to Russia's allegations and presentation of fact that Turkey has really good business dealings with ISIS on the ground, particularly with oil here. And I went from the Pentagon to the State Department to the White House, and they're not even saying the same thing. I mean, the Pentagon saying, oh, it's absolutely impossible, it's preposterous, it's ridiculous, nothing like that's happening. Then you go to the State Department on the same day. Well, it's not that much trade. I mean, it's not that significant. It doesn't make a big difference here. And then the White House, well, nobody's home. There's no comment there. I mean, one of the things that really bothers me is that Americans are so obsessed with the way they see the world. I've been living in Russia for a long time, and I'll tell you, the Russian political elite and a good part of the Russian population now simply don't believe America anymore. Just can't trust them because they don't do what they say and they don't say what they do. They're completely divorced. Ukraine and Syria stand out in a glaring way. Marcus in London.
Yeah, and I think as well, to try and understand how the Americans are approaching Syria, we've really got to go back to the early 1990s, because following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans saw a great opportunity in their eyes to achieve Western global dominance politically, economically and militarily. And the so-called right to intervene was, of course, implemented by the West in the former Yugoslavia. That was the testing ground. A lot of people in the West, in particular liberals, they believe that it started with Iraq. They're wrong. It started in the former Yugoslavia. They broke up Yugoslavia when they recognised the independence of Slovenia, Croatia and Bosnia, when they destroyed the sanctity of internationally recognised borders because they saw an opportunity to get themselves into a very strategic part of Europe. And then if we talk about Western media, the way Western media covers Ukraine, Libya and now Syria, that hasn't just begun in the last few years. Once again, that begun in the former Yugoslavia because Western media totally and utterly demonised the Serbs in Croatia, in Bosnia, and then in Kosovo. I was talking about just now how the British are talking about there being 70,000 so-called moderate fighters in Syria. Well, let's not forget, during the Kosovo War, the Americans and the British were saying 500,000 Albanians have been murdered by the Serbs. And then it was 100,000, then it was 50,000. And then, you know, it was 5,000. It goes down and down. So I really think if we're going to understand what the Americans and their allies are doing in the world, let's go back to the 1990s. Let's examine what happened in the former Yugoslavia, what Western politicians said and what Western journalists said during those dreadful conflicts that they actually caused.
You know, Martin, if I can go back to you in Beirut, I mean, it's been in Russia, people are still in mourning over the downing of the Russian jet by Turkish Air Force over a Syrian airspace here. And one of the things that's really, and you step back outside of the Western bubble, you know, the media bubble that people live in here, is that, you know, when you look at a country like Syria, its sovereignty is violated on a daily basis by numerous powers, and no one ever describes it that way, because Syria is Syria. Assad is Assad. All of these are the other. They're all negatives. No one looks at, you know, how the United States, Britain, France, and other countries, Turkey, violate the airspace of their neighbors every single day. And there's never, ever one line written about it in Western media, as if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's a great shame. The reporting on the ground is pretty shocking in some cases. We tend to take too much of a lead from spin doctors in London and Washington. But I think the incident of the Turkish jet, though, is slightly disturbing because the media has seized on it and they've somewhat demonized Erdogan in Turkey. And earlier you made a point about the diesel oil smuggling over the border, which I think is probably exaggerated. I don't think it's quite to the extent that some of the press are claiming. It's something that Erdogan hasn't really controlled very much. It's not a huge issue. What's much more of an issue is the illegal oil trade of ISIS shipping oil all right across Kurdistan up to the Turkish border, and then from where it goes after that, we don't know. Some reports have even suggested some of it's ending up in Israel. So yeah. I think when you look at sovereignty issues, yeah, I mean there is abuse all around. But the hypocrisy that I mentioned earlier, I think, kicks in here. You know, America and Britain has dictators all over the world in its pocket who carry out human rights abuses. Nothing is really said to any of those people if they're on the right side of the fence. Assad, from the very beginning, was isolated. I mentioned 2007 earlier, but in 2008, he was really put out into the cold. That was a huge mistake by the Americans. Marcus made a brilliant point in London. I wanted to make it myself, actually, that if you go back in history to the Yugoslav war, look what the Americans did. They tried to talk to Milosevic at the beginning. They didn't really do their homework very well. They didn't look at the history of the country and of the region, and they immediately demonized Milosevic because he didn't really have very good communication skills, and he didn't really want to talk to the West. So there's a knee-jerk response from America, which is that isolated countries that don't really want the aid or trade from Washington are a threat because they set an example to the
gentlemen,
region,
before
like
we end the
Vietnam,
program, I want to give one more example of this that we've forgotten here, is that days before the illegal coup in Kiev on February 22nd last year, the EU and the United States, they had daily conversations with President Yanukovych. He was a good guy. He was a guy you could make a deal with. And they met him in his office. They shook his hand. They took pictures with him. And they sent him birthday wishes. The next day, he was demonized, just like a lot of the leaders who have mentioned on this program. We're run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in London, Washington, and in Beirut. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. Elon. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. And in Beirut, we cross to Martin Jay. He is a journalist working for Deutsche Welle, Daily Mail, The National, and Al Jazeera. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus, there's still conflicting reports on what happened a few days ago, but there has been reported that a Syrian air base was bombed by the American Air Force, some jet planes going over. Of course, there's this denials and there's finger pointing and all that, but I find it very interesting. This could be a possibility for the escalation of the war against the Assad regime and not against terrorists, because we have the bombing campaign over the last year where the Americans have not targeted terrorists but mostly infrastructure. Is this an escalation in your mind?
I believe it's quite telling that, and I think there is the potential for greater American military intervention in Syria. And why do I say that? Because the West, led by the United States, is still sticking to its objective of seeing the overthrow of President Assad, who's the legitimate president of Syria in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter. And the West, along with its allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are still supporting various Islamist groups in Syria. And so this conflict, it's going to go on and on and on unless the West and its allies stop all forms of support to those Islamist groups in Syria. And, you know, this might sound offensive to some people watching this programme, but I actually happen to believe there is, potentially speaking, a military solution to the conflict in Syria. Yep. If the Turkish-Syrian border can be sealed off, because that's where most of the Islamist fighters and the jihadist fighters have flowed into Syria from. If that can be sealed off, if America and its allies in the region can stop all forms of support to Islamist groups in Syria, then the Syrian army, which is the heart and soul in the fight against Islamist terrorism, full stop, in conjunction with the Russian Air Force, can slowly but surely liberate Syrian territory. So while politicians in the West are talking about a political solution, I can't see how there will be a political solution because they are still supporting with arms, money and logistics those Islamist groups in Syria.
If I can go to Martin, I mean, hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The recent claim the U.S. bombed a Syrian military installation may be a telling example of how Washington and its allies intend to escalate their war on the Syrian regime and state, and not against terrorists. It would appear Assad remains target number one. To crosstalk the Syrian Civil War, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's editor of Politics First magazine. In Washington, we have Ivan